We're so glad that you could be a part of this today as we talk about refocusing the practice on privacy in a post-Equifax world. We oftentimes hear of big data breaches or compromises with credit cards and all kinds of other things that happen now, a little too common and a little too often. So it's going to be a great presentation today. And keep in mind too that all the presentations that we have ever done are all archived on our YouTube channel and through the MOROF.net website. So you can go there and you can click on the various different topics. Feel free to share those with anyone else within the practice or anyone else within your organization that could benefit from the various different topics that are there. And it's just there to be a great educational resource for everybody. And I didn't even introduce who I am. My name is Dorothy Mowbray. I'm on the board and also with the media chair, and I also represent Roar Internet Marketing, and glad to be a part of this organization for probably a good 5 years now or so. The speakers today from Chief Growth Officer, which is the name of the company. We've got Stephen Kaplan and Josh Rakes, and they are going to be talking about refocusing the practice on privacy. They entered this, many of you entered the profession in healthcare to treat patients, but all the litigation and regulatory risks as well as reputational risk is a threat to the ability to succeed. And Equifax served as a national wake-up call on the way businesses treat customer data and how to react when there is a breach. Don't wait for a breach or data security issue to happen for you to act. Ensure that you have the proper level of protection for the size and breach of the practice, and that is what they're going to be talking about today. Chief Growth Officer is a local company that is designed to help be the kind of the outsource of various different needs within a practice, CFO, COO, CSO, and CMO services. But including with that is Stephen Kaplan, who is served with companies across multiple industries in regulatory compliance and privacy roles since 2002, including serving as the Chief Privacy Officer for multiple organizations. He approaches his consultancy from a client-up perspective, taking care to learn business functions and objectives, and then applying to the privacy framework overlay rather than beginning from a regulatory schema or baseline and simply draping it over the business. He then builds strategies on a risk-based approach, and Stephen received his JD from Emory University in Atlanta and his bachelor's from the University of Florida. The other speaker is Josh Rakes. He is an experienced information security professional overseeing multi-million-dollar HIPAA compliance remediation and accessing the PCI compliance programs for Fortune 500 companies. He has consulted across a multitude of IT compliance and cybersecurity arenas. Josh has his MBA from St. Leo University and his undergraduate from UCF here in Orlando. So welcome them and take it away.
Thank you. Can everyone hear okay? Is everything working? Okay, great, wonderful. Okay, good morning. Again, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. My name is Steve Kaplan. We're going to get right to it. Our goal this morning is to try the best we can to make regulatory things seem interesting to everyone. So if we can do that, then we will have achieved our goals. Certainly, one of the things that actually came to mind as we kicked this off, as you were doing the intro, was that really folks who do what we do, if we're doing it right, we're in the business of prevention. If we do our jobs well, then we're going to get a lot more calls from businesses asking us to help ensure that they're protected so that something bad doesn't happen, rather than calling us when a breach does happen, right? Our ratio should be fairly favorable in that area. So what we want to do is make sure that, to the best of our ability, we help arm organizations with the ability to prevent these things rather than how to react once something is broken. So with that, I will talk about why privacy should matter to you. So, and I met a few people over coffee, and I appreciate the time. It was great to meet people with different backgrounds. Not everybody was in the industry, but most people were, and they were talking a little bit about their interactions with HIPAA and what it meant to them and in their business. And everyone's sort of vaguely aware of the regulation, and they might know that it only has one P and not two, like in HIPAA, which is probably the most common mistake, to the point where when asking for a mascot in one company, we came up with a hippo, the HIPAA hippo, to remind people what they need to do. So, but it does have only one P. That's one of the first things you need to know. But talking about it, they're sort of vaguely aware of the regulation, but they're not really sure, by and large, especially as we look at organizations, let's say under 50 employees, how to deal with it or how to wrestle with it. So they know the reg is there, but beyond that, a lot of people never get to kind of steps 2 and 3 about why this should matter to you. And step 2, not in importance, but just the order we're going to cover it, is the litigation risk, okay? So what you don't want is not only you don't want a regulator to come after you for a HIPAA breach, but you also don't want, if you think about the patients or consumers who use your business to be on the side where you're at litigation risk from a data privacy breach. And lastly, and I think least thought of and perhaps most importantly, is the reputational risk. And what the short way of describing this is front page risk. So the question is if your business or your practice has a breach, do you want to show up on the front page of the Orlando Sentinel? Like it's the don't be on this list kind of risk. And I think that my career, which is even outside the privacy world from a regulatory standpoint, it's one of the things I've probably tried the hardest to get across to CEOs. And this is from companies with 10 employees to companies with 10,000 employees or more. CEOs seem equally dissonant from understanding the concept of all this has to do is catch a little bit of a wave with the press, and we're all done here. Like, we pack it up, we go home, no one's ever coming to see you ever again, kind of thing. And it's really hard to get that through to people because it's to a lot of people, they think, well, that only happens to others, until it doesn't. And I think Equifax, which we'll talk about briefly later on, which is a giant company with allegedly layer upon layer of security and protections and methodologies whereby if one person doesn't do something, then someone else will. This company, who is the steward and holder of all these records for hundreds of millions of people, they had what I believe is going to stand for quite some time as the largest breach of consumer data, right? Not HIPAA, but still relevant. So if this giant company that only really does this stuff, they're not a medical office where their job is to see patients. They're a data company dealing with data. They missed it. How easy do you think it is to miss for organizations like ours, right? For those in the audience, who their day-to-day job isn't data. Their day-to-day job is seeing patients or doing something like that. And data is a thing they collect or a thing they use. It's far harder for them to keep their eyes on the prize. So it's our job to help you guys and to help the people that you work with, if you are able to translate this to them and give this to them, help them understand the importance of this so we can all get out in front of it. We talked already about us. I don't really feel we need to go any deeper into our backgrounds. Please don't hold my law degree against me. I always have to say that. No one likes a lawyer in the room. No one's ever excited, like, oh, good, a lawyer speaking. So we'll just forget about all that. I'll try to be as and that's why I said the thing in the bio about applying things from a client up perspective, because lawyers and regulatory nerds like myself tend to come in and bring the rules on the back of the Monopoly box and sort of drape them over the top of your organization and go, listen, I don't really care what it is you people do here. I'm the smartest person in the room, and I'm going to tell you the rules, and then we'll figure out what it is you people do later. It's really the reverse of that. Lawyers do it, right? Regulatory compliance people do it because we're terribly intelligent and smart and better than everyone, of course. So my approach has always been, and I was humbled, I'm sure, coming out of law school, that was my attitude, but my very first job was with a 5-person aviation consultancy. And the CEO said to me, and I was right out of law school and young and not all that bright probably, and he said, no one cares that you went to law school. Even though he hired me for that. And I think that having that experience at a very young age, I think helped alert me to the fact that the business matters first. And so that's something that's part of the reason why I joined up with chief growth officers because for the variety of things we do, that's really been the philosophy of our organization. So let's talk a bit about HIPAA. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time grinding on the regs, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about the regs, and then we're going to move on. If you guys want to do an hour-long nerd session about every little detail in the regs, ask me for my card, and we'll hang out. But other than that, we're just going to kind of touch it and move on to how, okay, what does this mean to me, or what can I do about this? We'll try to be a little bit more practical. So the law was established in 1996, obviously has been modified relatively recently, but in certain methodologies, but it's a creature of federal law, and essentially a covered entity, which is certainly if you're out there and you have a medical practice, you are a covered entity. You have to follow the privacy rule and the security rule. Privacy rule deals with protected health information in general. The security rule deals with electronic protected health information, so PHI in an electronic form. Practices still vary with this, even with the order to go into, to migrate into the world of electronic records. A lot of practices still have a lot of paper floating around. I was at one yesterday, personally. I went to the doctor and I was like, golly, there's a lot of paper here. And the office manager sort of shrugged and said, yeah, we're still transitioning. So while there are good and bad aspects to paper records from a data security and privacy standpoint, having to deal with both paper and electronic is kind of the worst of both worlds, because you really have to build a framework for both. So it's kind of like, that's why the migration is so important, not just because of the requirements, but it's just simpler to build your model around one rubric rather than kind of having both in mind all the time. But the privacy rule makes sure that the individual's health information is protected while allowing the flow of information thank you for that. That is perfect. That's much, much better. Allowing the flow of information between health providers. And then the security rule is going to establish a national set of security standards for protecting certain information that is transferred in electronic form. This is enforced by the Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights, which is just as scary as the name sounds. Other than hit you on the head with a stick division, I don't think they could have named that in a more intimidating fashion. And if anyone from the OCR hears this or sees this presentation, you should deeply consider changing your name to the hit you with the stick division. That's not in the notes, but absolutely true. Penalties. This is my favorite part. So penalties we'll get into a little bit later. It really, there's a few slides down, we'll kind of get a little bit into the weeds on penalties, but wide range of outcomes. As is the case with most state and federal regulators, the OCR has decided here, given itself a wide berth of outcomes when they find an issue in a business that they need to address from a HIPAA perspective, from as little as $100 per violation to as much as $50,000 per violation. And it's difficult other than what's fascinating about HIPAA to a big, again, regulatory nerd like myself is that this is one of those rules and laws where the enforcement is kind of, we'll know it when we see it. There's no pathway. So if you came to me and said, well, how do I make sure that if anything were to happen, the fines are only in the 3-figure range, so that if I do have one, I don't have a big one. They don't give us any prescription or any pathway or guidance on that. The best we can do as practitioners and as consultants is to look at the enforcement actions that have been filed and try to divine the outcomes and read the tea leaves. But the problem with doing that is its past results are not indicative of future performance, right? So when I deal with folks and I deal with some labor regulations and employment things for folks, it's much like tracking the EEOC. They can do within the very large guidelines of the law what they want, when they want, with very little repercussion. So if they decide for a particular offense, all facts being the same, it's always been $100 or $200 per VIO issue, to make that $1,000, there's really no second guessing. There's very little appellate process. There's very little you can do to fight City Hall. One of the old bromides I used to trot out when I was doing regulatory compliance in the finance industry was, when the federal government comes knocking, it's not, are you going to write a check? It's how much is the check going to be, right? So it's not, oh, we're going to fight this and we're going to win unless you have $50 million set aside for legal fees, right? Which most of us kind of don't. So the odds of, and that tends to be why a lot of the government agencies, when they go after organizations, they want to send messages. They're not going to go after, a lot of times, the organizations that have the biggest legal departments and the biggest war chests to fight them. They're going to go after organizations that might get the attention of those big companies and of those big organizations, but don't have the war chest and the ability to wage war against them, right? To sue them, to go after them, to fight the allegations, to fight the fines. They're going to go after organizations because when they hit that organization, this is not on the slides, but I'm riffing here. When they go after that organization and they're able to publish the results, the compliance officers, the privacy officers at big org, are paying attention. And they're turning to the business people, right, to the CMO, the chief medical officer, the CEO, the CFO at big co or big corp, and saying, this is a thing we need to be on top of. So now as a regulator, I've backdoor regulated a big organization that I probably didn't have the bandwidth to go after directly by going after a slightly smaller one and letting them know. The analogy I always use is, if you want to shoot the big, sometimes if you want to get the big deer off your land, you have to shoot the medium-sized deer and show the big deer that you shot him, and he'll leave. It's like, I've had enough here. You know, I don't need to go after him directly. I'm not a hunter, so that's probably a bad analogy. But you kind of, you know, it's a warning. It's heads on sticks. It's heads on spikes. You know, this is a warning to all who might come here that this is the way we do things with this regulatory agency. So, and this spans, by the way, this is not just a OCR thing. This is regulators in general use this tactic, and it's quite effective. Enforcement issues. Next slide is some real world, and I think, Josh, you might have some on this as I finish up here, but on this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about, and I have notes pages and pages long with specific examples that I won't bore you guys with. These are just a few sort of attention getters, okay? So I'm not going to read this out, but I'm just going to give you the highlights. The first bullet is perhaps the most important. The most common type of covered entity that have been required to take corrective action are private medical practices. Just going to let that sink in. So numerically, there are a lot of them. And OCR, but you think, like, gosh, OCR is using resources to go after a 5-physician practice in Poughkeepsie? Yes, they are. They absolutely are. So there is no, we're too small to get noticed. I have spoken to professionals in the past in this industry, office professionals, office managers, physicians who are like, well, there's like 4 of us. They're not interested. They're interested. There is no too small, because it's a binary issue, right? It's light switch on, light switch off. Do you have these kinds of records? Do you access them? Do you deal with them in any way? If yes, then they're interested. Simple. Again, when they're able to issue corrective action and they're able to publicize that, or they're able to even if they decide to do so anonymously as part of, let's say, a settlement, they can say, we went after a 5-physician group. It's a message to the rest of the small groups to get their act together. It's preventative. It's a preventative audit, right? They're trying to get the message out. So there is no such thing as too small. I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions I think in this industry is that, that they'll just go after the big practices or the big hospitals, the people who already have staff to deal with this. Those are the targets. Well, regulators know that the bigger the organization, the more likely they are staffed up and are dealing with this more aggressively. So they're going to find less fat to cut. They're going to find less to attack there, because there are people, sometimes many people, whose full-time job it is to think about this stuff every single day for that org. So they're going to find their ROI on that audit is going to be lower sometimes. Just a few quick examples. A mental health facility infected by malware. You'll hear that again today. Exposed records of 2,700 patients. Facility had no processes at all to deal with the intrusion. $150,000 fine. So I'll just pause for effect there. An eye and ear clinic Not a large organization by any stretch. Unencrypted laptop theft, access to patient data, all records, $1.5 million check write. I see people whispering, unencrypted laptops going home with personnel, leaving a computer, leaving the computers within your office environment are already something that we as privacy professionals have to deal with. Once they leave the environment and sit in the back of your car while you have 2-for-1s at Applebee's, it's a lot more problematic. Or Outback, it could be Outback. I'm not judging. I'm not judging. Happy hour, whatever. I have personally lived that. I don't know if we were together at that point in time, but I have personally lived that experience of the wandering unencrypted laptop and the agita that. And the organization that I work for, I looked at, this was advice I had given. I said, perhaps we should be able to remote wipe our laptops, like as we get larger, and just things sort of grow legs and walk away and, things of that nature. CEO goes, it's too expensive. Josh and I have heard that a million times. This is a health organization. It's too expensive. We don't want to deal with that. And the expense to a $20 million a year gross rev company was maybe 12 grand, 14 grand. I don't want to do it. Laptop watered away. I think 10,000 records potentially exposed. And I reapproached him a couple weeks later with the same memo I had written years earlier. Maybe now is a good time. Is now a good time? Should we talk now? He's like, yeah, maybe we should talk. I'm like, okay, good. All good things in time, I always say. Like, I'll give advice, and I'll just sort of stow it away for later and go, yeah, maybe I should trot this out. An orthopedic clinic failed to execute a BAA prior to turning over records to a potential business partner. It's a whole different. So it's not just what are you doing within your own organization, but who are you working with, and what access do they have to your records, and what made you decide to hire them, and when you did that, how'd you check on them? And now that they're hired, do you check on them regularly to make sure that they're still compliant? So I get a lot of I think another real common piece of pushback I'll get within this industry is, well, the majority of our PHI is with this electronic records vendor, and it's their risk, not mine. Really? So how'd you choose these guys?
Vendor management is one of the most overlooked as far as when you say, oh, well, I just outsource everything. Oh, great. Have you properly vetted who you're outsourcing to?
Right.
That's a big thing.
Yeah.
The other thing I just wanted to add is there was sort of the theme is there's no fish too small. And that's a trend that me being the information security, right? So I love to look at, all right, where's the malicious actors? Where are they going? And a lot of times you'll see that hackers are lazy. They like the low-hanging fruit. If I go after one of these Fortune 100 companies, sure, I could try and get in, but they have the tools and the resources and the manpower that I'm likely not going to be able to penetrate, or even, maybe Anthem, right? But you'll see a lot of times they do go after the smaller fish because they know they don't have the resources to be able to fight something. And that's sort of preventing those things from happening is easier than we think it is. So I just wanted to add that.
The analogy I use is it's like a smash and grab, right? If you're a thief. Just one more quick example. I've got these. We'll publish some of these to the group. If you guys are signed in, we can get you this information. But there's dozens of these. 5-physician cardiology group reached a $100,000 settlement as a result of an ongoing multi-year failure to comply with the HIPAA privacy and security requirements. So this does happen to smaller organizations. So there's, I like what Josh said. It's, it's high ROI, right? Easy to get at and low effort. Next, we're just going to talk about, just very briefly again, about the penalties. one of the things that we talked a lot about the monetary penalties already, so I'm going to kind of skip those. There are some criminal penalties depending on severity, right? Just to put further fear into everyone's mind. There, for unknowing or reasonable cause of violations, you can get the violator and negligent party can get up to 1 year in prison. Obviously, if someone commits a HIPAA violation for personal gain or malicious reasons, the stakes get a lot higher. Doing time for being lazy seems like a bad idea. I don't know there's ever a good time to be in prison, but it seems like this is one of the dumber ways to find yourself there, is not protecting your organization against information thieves and their ilk, just kind of blocking and tackling stuff. But I think one of the more important things, and I think I've hit that fairly hard, is from a patient perspective, feelings of anxiety and insecurity. Again, we work for businesses that want to ensure their current number of patients and or potentially grow. That'd be nice. Having something like this out there against you as a black mark, having patients and consumers be insecure or feeling anxiety is probably not the best path to grow. And let's face it, everywhere we work, we always, the people who run the businesses that we work with always think we're all terribly unique and we're different and we do what we do better than anyone else. But as with most things, there's probably someone else who does what you do and maybe isn't vulnerable to hackers. So they might be wanting to procure those services elsewhere, right? I mean, if you're a podiatry practice and you have a big data breach, I can probably get my feet looked at by someone that, has intrusion detection. I can find one. So it's probably, it's not, there are alternatives out there, and we definitely don't want our patients to be anxious about that sort of thing. Medical data is the gold standard for identity thieves. And if there's one point on the slide, and I have to be mindful of our time, but if there's one point on the slide, and Josh is going to fill in, is that this stuff doesn't expire. Raise your hand if you've ever had your financial identity compromised. To just kind of read the room, me too. And I was a victim back in the very early days before it was done via the internet, back in the Precambrian era. So roughly, just show of hands for the video, it was about just under a quarter of the crowd. You can shut down a credit card. You can change things out of a bank account. You can move money around and stem the blood loss that comes from financial identity theft. Medical records theft is forever, like a diamond. So once they take the records, like if somebody has your medical records and the doctors you've seen, that history never changes. Up until very recently, and what I can only assume is some sort of comedic misstep by the government, your Medicare identifier number had your social in it, which I loved. What a great idea, whoever came up with that. Let's just put their social right there and put some numbers in front of it. No one will ever know. Until very recently, after decades, they decided to change it. But the problem is those numbers have already been compromised for quite some time. So it's really the gold standard for data thieves. And there are consultancies who mine data on the dark web to try and find out what does stuff sell for? What's the going price on different records? And I pay a reasonable sum to get access to those reports. And I'll tell you that the medical data value right now is higher than credit card data because of that ability to shut it down. I'll know when you take my credit card and start using it, and I'll be able to move things around to stop you. I think if there's one thing on the slide that's worth transmitting to you guys, it's that. And that right now the valuations are about 20x. So the value of a medical record over a simple financial record is roughly 20x right now. It's like 19.28x. A regular financial record. Josh, you had some thoughts on the slide as well, I believe.
Yeah, I do, and it's kind of funny because I was in the middle of doing a PCI consulting job, and I get an alert from my bank, and my credit card was just compromised as I'm helping this business sort of go through their credit card compliance, so it was kind of ironic. But one in particular that stood out happened January of this year. It's Hancock Health in Greenfield, Indiana. and they got hit with Sam malware. Without going into too much detail, basically what Sam malware does is it's looking for remote desktop protocol, and then it does either brute force attacks or just compromises weak passwords. So they ended up latching on to a third-party vendor within Hancock's facility. And once the malware was installed, it ended up, there's over 1,400 critical files were encrypted. And it being malware, of course, they say, okay, you know, it's time to pay up. And ended up costing the company $55,000 in bitcoins, roughly $55,000 in bitcoins. Again, this facility likely did not vet properly the vendors that they were using, and it just shows a different path that potential malicious actors can take that will cause financial risk to the organization. So that's one that, you know, I wanted to highlight, and it's fairly recent. So the wounds are still there as far as Hancock's still concerned. So
Yeah, and that's, I mean, ransomware is its own half hour to hour if we wanted it to be. It's one of the more common ways to attack smaller organizations, and it's not unique to this area and this vertical. I mean, it's easy to deploy, it spreads easily, quickly, it can get in multiple ways. One of the easiest ways for malware to get into your system is through email attachments, and people are still, in this day and age, opening, you know, either have inadequate protections and or inadequate human being protections, in that people are still opening all sorts of nonsense they shouldn't be opening, in attachments and unzipping files. And I sound tired of it, because I am, because it's just the same stuff we say over and over again, which is, you know, don't fall for it. Don't, you know, this type of organization is not going to send this type of file. One of the things that I've been doing more and more of is a very narrow band of this, which is just email training, where it's a little half hour, quick, usually on like an LMS or an e-learning tool, just how to deal with email, how to manage the human side of this, because you can drop in all the technological protections you want, but ultimately at some point in time a human being can fat finger or do something that's going to expose you. So because of my background doing some training and HR stuff, which I've done in the past, on the ops side, it's okay, how can we retrain, you know, older and medium-aged dogs to do new tricks with emails and make sure that they don't open these attachments anymore. Please, for the love of God, don't open the attachments. And it's really an easy way for these guys to get in. And if you think about the ease of trying to sending these emails, these what are called phishing emails, for the people who seek to penetrate your organization, it's extremely simple. So again, it's about ROI. They're lazy. They can sit around and knock these out all day, and it doesn't take many to hit. To make 55 grand for very little effort while playing Xbox, like, sounds like an okay deal. Like, that sounds like a decent way to make a living, although albeit a criminal one. But I'm in Eastern Europe. The odds of me getting knocked out for this are pretty slim. So, you know, no one's coming to get me. So it's on our end here, and our businesses, to be vigilant and to make sure we protect.
And a lot of these, a lot of the, you know, going back to the malware, they're getting more and more sophisticated. But at the root level, if the email looks like it's from a credible source, read it again, because instead of a dash, it could be a hyphen or something to that extent. And then, oh yeah, it looks fine. And then once you open up the email, oh yeah, this is the attachment. Oh, once that's open, it's too late. So again, going back to the training, just maybe read the title, read the sender's email address a little more carefully, and that's actually can help prevent a lot of these things. So,
real quick, we've got a lot to go through in about 12 minutes until we open up for questions. So I'm going to pick up the pace here a little bit. I've never been accused of talking slowly, so I'll pick up the pace a little and get through the data more quickly. 2017 average 1 breach a day. The 3 bullet points below here are your leading causes. Insider wrongdoing or errors. This is the wandering laptop example that we talked about before. Could be included in that. Hacking, IT incidents, malware, and ransomware, which we just hit on just a touch. The easiest one real quick point in my notes that I wanted to touch is theft of PHI by employees is difficult to eradicate, but one of the easiest cause of data breaches is to prevent the theft of electronic devices containing unencrypted PHI. So that's one of the ways that this industry has started to make headway, is to encrypt more and to be able to keep devices on campus, and when they leave campus to be able to wipe those devices as soon as one knows that they've left if they're unauthorized. This is also known as, why does that laptop have that file on it, right? This is part of the analysis when we'll come into an organization. Why does that person have a laptop? Well, we give everyone laptops. And why is that? It's just those basics. Does that person really need, can we go with desktops, which tend to wander less for certain people? I mean, it's just a lot of this is some pretty highfalutin stuff depending on who you're in the audience. We have some very sophisticated IT and data security professionals out there too. But I think that for most of the businesses that we go into, I ask a lot more questions: the who, what, where, when, and why. What data are we using? How are we using it? Where does it come from? How do we store it? What kind of devices do we have, and who has those? And it's just really asking those questions of, based on that person's role, do they need a laptop? And if so, does that laptop need to have that file? Stuff like that. And it's about having that analysis run, not just once, but consistently, at least once per year, to make sure that we're holding up to the standards. Because the hackers and the attackers and those who seek to do the business damage are not standing still on this stuff. They're not going, well, we're just going to mint out one kind of ransomware and we'll just see how it goes, and we're just going to go to sleep for the next 5 years and see how it runs. They're as they are foiled or as their efforts are stunted, they're trying new and different ways, because ultimately their goal is to get at this data. What does this mean to you? Know the rules, right? If you don't know them, have somebody train the organization on them. Conduct periodic assessments. If you've never had an assessment conducted, have one conducted, figure out where you are against a sensible baseline. Remediate the gaps that make sense for your business based on size and types of data that you use, access, etc. Consider cyber liability insurance. It is I wouldn't want to say developing market. I would say the market for cyber liability insurance is developed and growing. I would say the insurance companies are getting more intelligent. There are reasonably sized policies out there with premiums that most businesses can afford. If you can't, then there are probably other financial issues inside your organization. You can get a policy that generally will work for most reasonably healthy businesses without a ton of muss or fuss. Obviously, the bigger you are and the bigger data risk you have, the more arduous the application process and the higher the premium, just like any insurance. But we have relationships with several brokers, happy to connect you if you're interested, that provide this sort of stuff, and definitely worth looking into. And if you look into it and decide it's not for you at this time, that's fine. But I highly recommend having some backup and some peace of mind. No, I don't get a commission. No, I don't get a finder's fee. But as a risk management guy, I love insurance, and I think it's a good idea here, because it's certainly a front on which the attacks are growing, both in number and in velocity and penetration depth. Real-world issues. Just very, very quickly, for the 8 people in the universe who've never heard about the Equifax breach, and the numbers are still kind of being tweaked, but roughly, just for the sake of argument, about 140 million people affected. So, just under, skosh under half of the American population would be affected by this. Terrible press, awful PR. Thank God for Equifax that they're in an industry where there's not a ton of competition. The barrier to entry in starting up an Equifax competitor is quite high. There are exactly 3 true competitors to Equifax, and they kind of split the market between them. And so Equifax, if this were to happen in another vertical or another industry, I think the outcomes and the harm to the organization would be far more dramatic. Equifax as a business will likely recover from this. Most businesses won't. In this field, if a giant insurance carrier had this happen to them, depending on market, of course, if you have options, people would start taking those other options. Right? People, for those of you that deal with insurance a lot, health insurance, you know that most people default back into a plan, especially on the individual side, based on just sort of stasis. As long as nothing materially changes on the benefits or premium side, they kind of dance with who brung them. But imagine if UHC or Humana or Aetna had a breach of this size and you had options as a consumer, you would leave. Even on the group side, if you had options, you would probably leave. So I don't think that an industry on our side of the fence in the health world would survive quite as well as Equifax did. Not only did Equifax have a giant breach, due mostly to the human error and lack of patching, which we can talk about another day, they waited a very long time to deal with it. They said nothing for a long time, and when they said something, it wasn't much. They didn't say, I think, what their shareholders and what the general public would have been happy with. So someone in PR and corporate communications probably got fired, more likely multiple people. So it was kind of a great case study. Forget about the errors that led to the breach, but how they handled it. It had, I mean, there's got to be some communications consultants that are making money off just this case study, that are going, I'm going to help make sure this doesn't happen to you. And people are slamming down, buckets of money going, okay, fine, you got me, take my money. Because it's really a case study on how not to handle a breach from a corporate communications standpoint. Josh, do you have anything before I move on to, I want to make sure I'm mindful of time. I know you've got one coming up. But.
No, just just want to speak real quickly to some of the trends from last year. The healthcare sector accounted for 28.3% of all breaches across all industries. So that's kind of a staggering fact. Last year, nearly 6 million records were exposed. The good news, the number of breaches that occurred of 100,000 or more records actually decreased. So that's good. But again, the bad news is the number of total breaches has increased. So sort of going back to the low-hanging fruit. This is, at least last year, that's the trends that we saw. That's all I had for that one.
I'm going to go through these next two kind of quickly. The most common things we see in organizations of small to small mid-size, and even, frankly, in large organizations, now that I think about it, because I looked at the very first one and thought of a client that I'm arguing about this with right now. Having a compliance plan that is not effective or not followed. They have one, they just don't do anything with it and probably don't follow 45% of it. Can be taken as evidence that a violation is knowing and willful. Employees purposefully or accidentally disclosing data, medical records mishandling, lost and stolen devices and drives. I think we've beaten that point well into the ground. Texting patient info happens more commonly than you think. That's a real head slapper. Inadequate protections against malware. Frankly, one of the easiest ways to have someone into your system. Emailing patient information without using secure email. Social media, oh boy. Here's a selfie of me on Instagram at work. And in the background is my screen with all these patient records on right there. Happens more often than you think. Again, one of the dumber ways to have a problem in your organization. And I think that's an age thing, because kind of a Gen Xer, I'm on the old age of being, my kids use Instagram and Snapchat. Like, that's not a me thing. But that's where all the pictures, I don't want this face on any selfies. But and they'll take these, especially, this happens a lot in the millennial generation, a lot of workplace selfies. And that's fine in certain workplaces, but not in the workplace that we have, because the odds are there's something behind you that the universe doesn't need to see, right? How about a picture of a patient in the office, which is in and of itself potentially a PHI? The fact that a person is a patient at the covered entity is in and of itself a piece of data that has to be protected. It's not just their social and what they had done there and when they came, just the fact that they're there alone. Protecting your practice, potentially the most important item. Having a privacy and security person that does not, before anyone panics, does not have to be a full-time person. It doesn't necessarily even have to be an employee. Do you have someone who knows what they're doing, who's looking after your business? That's it. Just make sure you've got someone. I look at this, and again, this is where my law degree sort of comes into play and clouds my thinking. But most businesses aren't big enough to have their own general counsel. They don't want one. They don't need a lawyer around, thank God, right? But they have someone outside who's knowledgeable on the types of things that matter to their business that can help them stay on the right side of the law, that they can talk to, that checks in with them periodically. That's what I have in mind here, especially for smaller organizations. You do not need to go out and hire yourself a $200,000 a year privacy officer. You need to have an IT environment that is HIPAA compliant, whether it's taken care of internally or taken care of externally. They would need to partner with either your internal IT team or your outside IT team needs to partner with your data security and privacy experts. That's the hand in glove scenario to make sure that this thing works well. Documented, communicated, and enforceable policies and procedures. If you have a 5-physician practice and you adopt a procedure that you steal off the internet from a giant hospital, the odds are pretty good it's not suitable for you, you're not doing the right things, it doesn't make any sense, you might as well have nothing at all. You're actually worse off having a policy you don't follow. Training, documentation, and then having the proper safeguards around the business, which is its own session. Josh, do you have anything before we do the conclusion and throw it to questions?
No.
Okay.
I'm good.
I'm 2 minutes over time here. So the penalties, again, rehashing a couple things to drive this home. Penalties are not just regulatory, financial, but also reputational. Not having policies or procedures is a liability, but if you have them, follow them. So be sensible about what you draft up, how you implement it, and the people you implement it with. Medical is the most attractive target. It is the gold standard. If I'm sitting at home, again, playing Xbox, and I want to hack something or someone, or I want to go after an industry, this is where I'm headed. Start with a security mindset, right? Make sure that your organization tries to think in a protective manner at all times, right? What can we do to be safer? With that,
We'll start with
Yeah, we'll start
any
with any
questions that
questions.
anyone has,
Absolutely.
and just wait till I get the mic to you so that way I can get you on the video.
Hi, good morning. Great presentation. I'm Tina Phillips with Expense Reduction Analysts, and we're one of those companies that get outsourced to look at overhead expenses. I generally shy away from signing a BAA because I don't want PHI. I don't need PHI. I don't care who's sleeping in the bed. I just wanted to know how much the bed costs.
right.
So, what about that? I mean, am I obligated to sign a BAA? And the reason I ask is because there's so many of us, there's analysts involved with my projects that if I sign the BAA, I'm signing for them too.
Right.
That are they supposed to keep all of their information under lock and key, and how do I know they're in the, Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to make sure. I don't want to take all of the questions. So basically, I mean, one of the things I always say is it necessary to have access to a record to do the business of the essentially the business associate, right? If you can organize it with your clients where you don't have any access to PHI, then they should not be requiring you to sign. The mere fact that you do work with them doesn't automatically make you a business associate. It's only if you're accessing or have any access to PHI. If no access to PHI, then not a business associate. So the mere fact that one does business with a covered entity does not automatically, it's not algebraic like that. So the best way to protect your business, or, I mean, look, for your own reasons that are outside of the medical industry, it's probably good to have some of this stuff in place, but we could talk about that offline. But that's the way I would protect myself if I were advising you guys, is how can we orchestrate it with our clientele where we do not take any access to that data?
If I could do a follow-up question. Dorothy Mowbray with Roar Internet Marketing, we build a lot of websites for the medical industry, and when someone fills out a lead form on their website, it's not necessarily that they're a patient, but they're a prospective wanting to maybe book an appointment or get more information or whatever. Would we need to make sure that we have a business associate agreement with every one of our medical clients that has that kind of information, or is that not considered a patient yet, so we're okay?
Generally, yes, because some portion of them will become patients, and unless you were to know which ones would and which ones do and which ones do not, and somehow decline your own access to that information, a prospect is not necessarily going to be PHI information. It's actually a very good question. But I think the inability for a vendor like yourself to know which ones end up as patients and which ones don't would mean that I would build these protections that you guys would end up as a business associate. Okay. When in doubt, generally the regulator is going to hold a vendor in this industry to business associate standards, and even when they don't, and I have multiple clients who are held to business associate standards who under the law are not business associates. Why? Because their clients in the health industry demand that they be such.
Yes, and
you must protect yourself in this fashion, because I'm just not dealing with anyone who's not protected. I'm not going to, in my medical business, deal with an organization that isn't holding themselves to the safeguards.
Hi, my name's Craig. I'm with CSR and Associates. And actually, I was looking at the Equifax thing, and you're talking about 130 million files were stolen, and I thought that was interesting. And then you said, well, last year only 6 million were stolen, and I start thinking, gosh, that's decades and decades worth of files. That put a whole nother perspective on it for me. But that wasn't my question. My question was, I'm just curious, why are the medical records more valuable? I mean, what does it matter if I had a skin cancer cut off last week? How's that more valuable to a thief than my bank account?
They can, Josh, you want this one, or you want me to take it?
Well, we touched on it a little bit earlier. You know, as far as from a PCI credit card security, you know, if you compromise my credit card, I can just call my credit card company, turn that card off, get a new card. And with credit cards, it's not really my money; it's their money that you're stealing. With PHI, it's you know, it doesn't change, right? So if I know, and this years back, there were state-sponsored actors that were actively going after the U.S. healthcare records, and a lot of that was actually just for trending analysis and things like that. As far as
yeah, I've got. I was flipping. Sorry, hopefully that didn't come through. One of the aspects, the subsets of medical data that's the most valuable is terminally ill patient data, because these folks can use it for identity theft. They can back into identity theft through the medical records. After the person dies, they can continue to exploit their identity. It's much easier to do identity theft from dead people than it is from people who are alive, because the changes aren't made. And as a person with a wife who's an estate lawyer, once the person who's a estates and trust lawyer, once a person's dead, no one's like looking after things for identity theft, especially once the estate's closed. That becomes a very useful account. And as I said, I think if you think about, there's decades and decades on the Medicare side of records where what's called the HICN number, which is my Medicare identifier, had my social in it. So they're making a change now going forward, but if I can get at your practice's records, anybody who's on Medicare, I can get their social. I can derive their social from their HICN number. Change it going forward all you want. I can still go after everything going backwards, and it's not like your social changed. So it's still a very valuable record to me. And the social is one of the big keys, right? Because it can be exploited over and over again. It can't be changed like a bank record or credit card.
Hi, my name's Carl Moback. I'm with Eucharis Technologies. We're a managed security solutions provider. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more in depth on the IT assessment process. Often there's a lot of people that say we'll do free network assessments, but essentially it's just kicking the tires, checking whether or not the windows and doors are shut. But to help people understand what's involved in a thorough IT assessment on the HIPAA and PCI realm when a breach has occurred, you got to go through the who, what, where, when, and why the breach occurred, and the log information, which is vast and numerous, and how that has to be in a pristine state for validity and so forth. So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it.
I think PCI will attack on a different day, but as far as a HIPAA assessment, some of the ingredients, I'll let Josh speak to that.
Yeah, sure. And so not really speaking postmortem, because that's more diving into the forensics and log reviews and things like that, trying to tie the who, what, when, why, and how much what was compromised. But as far as from an initial standpoint, a gap assessment is ideal. So just taking a look at people, processes, and then the technology, right? So the people, both internal and external, so vendor reviews, properly vetting vendors, and then looking at, okay, what's the flow of data? How do you have PHI in your environment? How does that PHI come in, or sorry, EPHI come in? Where's it stored, and where's it leaving? And understanding that flow will you pull in certain systems and other systems that might be attached. Is there a business justification to attach these? If not, decouple it, and there you're reducing your scope of attack vulnerabilities, basically. So yeah, there's not really depending on the size of the organization, depending on the complexities, and it can vary, but that's when I go in, I tend to look at people, processes, and policies.
Around data, where does the data go, right? I always say it's kind of like a river, and the banks of the river can expand and contract, right? It can flood and dry up, but it's always kind of cutting a path. And what fields does that river touch? Where does it go through? And then analyzing how it goes through each field, right? When I say field, I don't mean data field, I mean like a field of wheat, right? Where's the river flow? And so I have to figure out that map. We figure out the landscape together. We draw that map if it's not already drawn in the business, right? By asking very basic rudimentary questions. And this is more of a small company approach. Big companies ask for a data map, and I have it. A systems list and reasons, they have all this stuff. But what are you using to access the data? What does it touch? Why? Who's using it? Who has access to that system? Why? Some of the basic questions I was talking about before. I mean, there is no, and I think we'll close with this, there is no HIPAA A++ rating. There is no HIPAA certification. If someone says, I want you guys to sign something that says I'm HIPAA compliant, the regs don't give you a specific prescribed, I wish they did, by the way. They don't say, well, if you do these 5 things, you shall be HIPAA compliant. Have this intrusion detection and go through anti-phishing training, and that's all she wrote. It's not that easy. So now there are certifications one can obtain that are from for-profit agencies that if one obtains those certificates, you will be determined 99.999 times out of 100 as HIPAA compliant. If you're following that methodology, you obtain the certificate and you're still following it, right? Not I obtained it and then I just started throwing laptops out there to the universe, obviously. But there's just no, it's a process, right? Where are you versus where you should be, and constantly analyzing that, again, no less than once per year for any business of any size, and for bigger businesses more frequently than that, about where you are versus the rubric of compliance.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a good round of applause.